Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I want to thank the distinguished chairman and the ranking member, Mr. McCall, for their strong support for this effort, both bills that are up today. And I would also especially like the Speaker for her leadership as well. Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, since the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre 30 years ago, I've had the privilege of working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle, including and especially Speaker Pelosi, Jim McGovern, my good friend, and he's the chairman of the China Commission, and I'm ranking member, Congressman Frank Wolf, former member who was tenacious in his fight for human rights, the rule of law, and democracy for the people of China. We have always believed that every person deserves better than the brutality so many endure and the systematic violations of their universally recognized human rights. China's ruthless dictators do not agree, and they are obsessed to tighten their control. Today, Mr. Speaker, Hong Kong is burning. The status quo is no longer. The brutal government crackdown on democracy activists has escalated. Tragically, under President Xi Jinping, human rights abuse throughout China has significantly worsened, including the pervasive use of torture, religious persecution, human trafficking, and genocide against Muslim Uyghurs. Last month, Mr. Speaker, President Xi ominously warned of even more brutal violence to come in Hong Kong, threatening, quote, crushed bodies and shattered bones. And the Hong Kong government itself prefers bullets and batons over peaceful and political dialogue that would address the Hong Kong people's rightful grievances. That is sad, and it's a sad and disgusting reality. And it is what the Chinese government, however, does best: suppress, repress, torture, kill, and censor. With the passage of the Hong Kong Human Rights Act, the United States Congress is making it clear that beating, torturing, and jailing democracy activists is absolutely wrong. We stand in solidarity with the people of Hong Kong. There will be strong sanctions, other ramifications for this crackdown, for this abuse of power. The people of Hong Kong have feared for their freedom for a long time. In 2014, Mr. Speaker, I met with Martin Lee and Anson Chan, two titans of Hong Kong's democracy movement. They and Scott Flipsy of the China Commission and I met in my office for hours as we discussed the Chinese Communist Party's growing influence and their attempts that had already begun to degrade autonomy and human rights in Hong Kong. That is, Mr. Speaker, the genesis of this bill and our 5-year effort to push back on Beijing's pernicious interference in Hong Kong. In the midst of the 2014 umbrella movement, I first introduced, joined by Speaker Pelosi, the first Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. My CECE co-chair, Senator Brown of Ohio, introduced the same bill in the Senate. Over the years, in 2015 and 2017, Senator Rubio and I upgraded the bill to reflect the kidnapping of booksellers, the disqualification of elected lawmakers, and the political prosecution of Joshua Wong, Nathan Law, Benny Tai, and many others. However, every single time we pushed for passage, there was vigorous opposition from diplomats, so-called experts, committee chairs, and U.S. business interests in Hong Kong. So passage of this legislation is long overdue. My House bill, co-sponsored by my good friend and colleague Jim McGovern of Massachusetts and 46 other bipartisan co-sponsors, passed last month on October 15th. Today we consider a final bill derived from working with our colleagues in the United States Senate. Specifically, the Act directs the Secretary of State to report and certify to Congress annually whether Hong Kong continues to deserve special treatment under U.S. law, different from mainland China in such matters as trade, customs, sanctions, enforcement, law enforcement cooperation, and protection of human rights and the rule of law. It directs the State Department not to deny entry visas based primarily on the applicant's arrest or detention for participating in nonviolent protest activities in Hong Kong. It requires, for the next 7 years, an annual report from the Commerce Department on whether Hong Kong government adequately enforces U.S. export controls and sanctions laws, including on those goods and services transshipped to North Korea, Iran, or other countries relating to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, narcotics trafficking, and more. It requires an assessment of whether U.S. origin items, including software, technology, and services, have been transferred from Hong Kong to China in violation of U.S. law and have been used by China for mass surveillance, predictive policing, or for the so-called social credit system. I know some members may be wondering, what is the social credit system? It's a ubiquitous, totalitarian, brave new world system scheduled for implementation by 2020 that uses public records, online activity, and other tools of surveillance to aggregate data on every Chinese citizen and business and use that data to monitor, shape, and rate financial, social, religious, or political behaviors. The bill requires the President to submit a strategy to Congress to protect U.S. citizens and businesses in Hong Kong from the erosion of autonomy and the rule of law because of the actions taken by the Chinese government. It requires the President to identify and sanction persons in Hong Kong or in mainland China responsible for extrajudicial rendition and gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. The Chinese government warns us repeatedly not to interfere in China's internal affairs. But the only interference I see is Beijing's meddling in the democratic freedoms of Hong Kong. All I see, and this body sees, my fellow colleagues, is Beijing's failure to honor the promises made in the 1984 Sino-British Declaration, an international treaty. All we see is Beijing's failure to honor the promises of Hong Kong's basic law. We cannot avert our lives to what is happening in Hong Kong. We cannot silence our voices when the rule of law, democracy, human rights, free speech, and autonomy are being threatened in Hong Kong. We must remain steadfast in support for the people of Hong Kong. The whole world has a stake in a peaceful and just resolution in Hong Kong. The passage of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is an important signal that this Congress, Democrat, Republican alike, House and Senate, considers Hong Kong's freedoms and autonomy a critical interest of the United States and the international community. In Hong Kong, they encourage each other to keep pressing forward with the phrase, "Jia Yo." So today I say to you, all of you in Hong Kong, "Jia Yo, your cause is a noble one, and you will not be forgotten." I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves balance of time. Gentleman